But Big Larry came out just to put him down. SpongeBob turned into a clown, and no girl ever wants to dance with a fool who went and played a bunch of SpongeBob Game Boy games. That's right, kitchen sponge enthusiasts. In today's rendition of Riders Replay, we're taking a dip into the toxic waste dump that is Bikini Bottom and revisiting all the games that can be played on this bad boy. This has become my most prized possession, my baby! I never owned a Game Boy Advance as a kid, so it actually feels pretty riveting to have this in my hands. What's even better is that I get to revisit one of my favorite franchises, playing a bunch of games I never got to play as a kid, which I'm very sure are, shiny. Starting with one that might not be all that shiny nowadays, but certainly still shimmers like your grandma at a strip club. SpongeBob Squarepants Legend of the Lost Spatula is mainly famous for being the first ever SpongeBob game to have ever come out. I mean, we have to roll out the red carpet for a trendsetter, no matter how mediocre it actually is. It was developed by Vicarious Visions and released all the way back in 2001 on a Game Boy Color. SpongeBob comes across some sort of legendary statue, which Mr. Krabs reviews is the entrance to some town eventually taken over by the Flying Dutchman. Mr. Krabs then tells SpongeBob to unlock the entrance to the ancient civilization so that he can become the greatest fry cook to have ever lived. And of course, line Mr. Krabs' fat pockets. The game doesn't really have a level-to-level structure. In fact, it kind of functions more like an open world game in a way, as you're basically traversing all across Bikini Bottom to look for various items to help you progress. As a result though, this is a game that really needed some sort of tracking system, because otherwise I felt hopelessly lost, though not quite to the extent of Squidward having a mental breakdown in the Kelp Forest. I mean, it does have a map, but like, what the fuck am I looking at? I grew up in the 2000s, so I do not have an internal GPS I could just pull out my eye socket and use. And even if I did, it probably just murdered me and guide me over the cliff. Gameplay wise, it's a pretty typical 2D platformer, but I mean, what else was the very first SpongeBob game going to be? An RPG? The only thing that really irked me about this game was the jump being super dramatic. The camera shifts too much whenever you do, which can make it hard to land on certain platforms. I can tell you for certain that my 2020 vision definitely doesn't cover this. I will say though, the theme song recreation goes hard. In fact, the entire soundtrack just smashes in general. Like, I would gladly suffer from ear rape listening to the soundtrack at excruciating frequencies. The soundtrack isn't the most SpongeBob sounding soundtrack for sure, but I just genuinely think this is good Game Boy Color music, and to get that from a random SpongeBob game is such a flex. Visually, it is a Game Boy Color game, but if there's one thing I'll praise it for, it's the fact that despite the technological limitations, this game does a great job at adapting the SpongeBob feel to the hardware. The SpongeBob sprite animations are my favorite part of this game. He also will progressively lose his clothes as he takes damage and will flat out die when he's naked. He also does a dance move similar to one he does during the Jellyfish Rave. It's stuff like this I love to see in any licensed game, just pure examples of the developers actually caring enough to adapt the property in an accurate way and having fun with it. It feels like a SpongeBob adventure. Hell, even when I got those chests that say April Fools, I'm laughing my ass off at the reference. And the fact that this was the first game for a show that was still very new is a feat in and of itself. I can't say Legend of the Lost Spatula is an out-of-the-worldly experience that everyone and their mom should be camping outside of a retro game store for, but to me, it's a very promising start to the potential of SpongeBob games that meet that perfect balance between solid gameplay and, well, sponginess. All I have to say is thank God this wasn't the first SpongeBob game entry, because if it truly had been, I can't think of a worse note to start off on. Yes, SpongeBob's second entry on the Game Boy consoles was SuperSponge, a game that also served as SpongeBob's first console experience, releasing on the PS1. Both versions were developed by Climax Studios, a company more well known for creating a couple Silent Hill games. And well, I can certainly see the horror aspects of this game materialize in some very creative ways. In this game, SpongeBob's on a mission to give Patrick the best birthday gift ever by obtaining a signed photograph from Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. But because these guys are assholes, they instead try to send SpongeBob off to do ridiculous fetch quests in the most random locations in an attempt to get SpongeBob off their backs. Not really a terrible premise, but here's where I'm gonna start cooking. So of course, the game is a 2D side-scroller, but it being on the Game Boy Advance, it at least has more distinct visuals to help objects and environments stand out compared to the previous game. I mean, I don't have a ton to say about this one here. Nothing about this gameplay struck as necessarily awful to me, but it is certainly quite bland, especially in comparison to some of the titles coming up. Nonetheless, what I am bothered by though, and this is where I'm really gonna cook because I mean, ever tasted well done sponge, is this game's claim to being a SpongeBob game. Now, when I look at licensed games, a huge aspect I personally look for is how well this game actually adapts the franchise it's based off of. I mean, what other reason is there to play a licensed game for being real here? It's very rare that these games actually innovate gaming norms the way games like Mario and Sonic do. This is still relatively early in the SpongeBob lifespan, so I would have gone a lot easier on this game if it wasn't for the fact that Legend of the Lost Spatula, a Game Boy Color game, actually did a decent job at adapting the franchise in ways I was honestly surprised by. So tell me why in this game the first level is called Jelly Fields. I mean, that just sounds wrong. It literally makes me want to claw my eyes out. I just cut my nails though, so sadly I can't. And why is Squidward so happy? And why is he offering SpongeBob a jellyfishing net? This is the face of a serial killer, I'm telling you. And can we talk about the enemies in this game and how they look like actual sea creatures? None of these baddies look like anything you'd see in the show besides that random fish that just comes running towards you for no reason. This really is the clearest example to me of the developers just not giving a fuck about the SpongeBob franchise. And while we're at it, look at how god awful this game looks. I mean, sure, Legend of the Lost Spatula isn't anything impressive visually, but at least it keeps a consistent style going throughout its adventure. This weird ass hybrid between semi-realistic and completely 2D sprites does not mesh well at all, and honestly makes SuperSponge look like a bootleg game. And the music in here is actually ear rape. Like, there are moments in the music where it literally sounds like the synthesizer or something is glitching out, and everything about the soundtrack just sounds horrendous. And also the sound design is almost non-existent. Like, look at this boss where it feels like 90% of the sound effects are literally missing. The game does have some signs of adapting the show well. I will give it props for including a level with the fish hooks, which is an episode I feel like should be referenced way more in SpongeBob games, all things considered. But then the game goes in a complete 180 and dedicates a whole chapter to exploring the Earth's core. I just had to stop. I had to stop. Definitely one of the worst games I've ever played. As someone who grew up playing the console version where the Dutchman is an absolute menace, abducting all your friends and loved ones one by one, finding out that the whole premise of the GBA version is that SpongeBob frees the Dutchman and just decides to look for all his treasure is the biggest whiplash I have ever experienced. Now granted, things may change throughout the story of the game, but since I never got that far, the Dutchman being a harmless geriatric is the image that remains in my head. Thankfully, Climax is out of the picture and Vicarious Visions returns to helm the game. The whole premise of the game is SpongeBob finding all 10 of the Dutchman's treasures because SpongeBob for some reason believes the Dutchman to be a genie that will grant him a wish if he were to collect them all. I mean, isn't SpongeBob supposed to be the happiest creature under the sea? Why does he need a wish from a genie? I smell fraudulence. It's a 2D side-scrolling platform like any other licensed GBA game, but the mechanic that helps this one stand out from the others is the game's bubble mechanic. You see, blowing bubbles is about the only other thing SpongeBob can do besides walk and jump. Depending on what colored bubble bottle you pick up determines what the bubbles you use can do. There's the basic bubble that traps enemies, which you can use to maneuver the level. There's bubbles that act as springs, boosting you up the level. There's bubbles that float to the top, making the last one completely useless. And then there's the power bubbles that can take out enemies. This would be a fine mechanic and all, but instead of being able to switch between the bubbles on the dot, you have to simply find the bubble bottle throughout the levels in order to use them. So the game basically picks and chooses what bubbles you need at which moments, which just feels like a missed opportunity to add something really cool here, but not the game's worst offense. I will say, however, that playing this game almost feels like the most awkward day in the history of the planet. Do you ever go out with someone and feel like everything you do is literally just wrong and that you're gonna die afterwards? I have, many times.
Me too!
Well, playing this game honestly feels like that. I'm fully aware it really could be a skill issue. I'm certainly not an expert gamer, nor will I ever claim to be, but a lot of times the platforming here honestly feels tedious and not all that well thought out. Like, did that platform really need to be that far out? Do I really have to be that precise with my jumps in a Spongebob Game Boy Advance game? Do the jellyfish really need to be that close to me as I try to avoid them in this closed off space? There was also this minigame, the Krusty Krab, where you had to prevent Plankton from getting his hands on a Krabby Patty, and I could not get past this stupid game because of how frequent those robots came to grab them. Your only maneuver to stop the robots is to blow bubbles upwards, which in and of itself is not a quick move. And when you combine that with the fact that sometimes the bubbles just blow out sideways anyway, it's some real bullshit. I could totally be missing something here, but I fell off during this section of the snow level and could not figure out what to do here. For the life of me, I cannot find a way to get out of this stupid pit. Like, the level design in this game just feels super dense, and okay, I'm just gonna say it, it's too fucking hard for me. It's not as bad as SuperSponge, I'll give it that, and the game also does a nice job of adapting the SpongeBob license. But beyond that, goodbye! Now, this is the tea, okay? I know it's called Battle for Bikini Bottom, but I also know that it is in no way the same exact game as one of the greatest games to have ever existed. But I also know it's called Battle for Bikini Bottom. It is impossible for me to go into this with some sort of objectivity simply because the Battle for Bikini Bottom gas is everywhere in the air 24/7, and I've been smoking and inhaling my whole goddamn life. In all seriousness, I have absolutely no idea what to expect from this. I mean, I think it's safe to say the console version has absolutely devoured the other versions of this game, but I mean, this is another entry from Vicarious Visions, so perhaps they finally got it together for this entry. Big difference in the plot here is they don't even waste time trying to make it seem like SpongeBob is responsible for the robot invasion. He's just expected to stop it, which I mean, well, yes. Of course the person that's going to stop the invasion is the yellow sponge. Also, what happened to Squidward's smile here? This and Revenge of the Flying Dutchman are definitely the oddest looking sprites of all the games here. Like, why are SpongeBob's eyes this overwhelming shade of crystal blue? And why do they all look slightly 3D but not at the same time? I don't know, it's a little uncanny. This is really cute though. The game functions as another 2D side scroller, but there's definitely some weird design choices here. For one, you can't destroy a single robot in this game, except the bosses, I guess. You can stun them, but they really function more like platforming elements, which, while weird for me to adjust to given the combat of the console version, actually did make for some of the more original platforming I got to play for this video. In each level, you need to collect 3 golden spatulas in order to finish it. Otherwise, if you get to the end without all 3, you're forced to backtrack to find where you may have missed one. This may seem like a pain, but at least for the first few levels, they're not very long, and as long as you're properly exploring these levels that aren't all that big, you'll find them no problem. The biggest aspect of the game that makes this stand out from the other titles though is the use of mystery. For about half the levels I did get to play, mystery was there and ready to be ridden. As exciting as it looks to be able to ride her in this manner, it really doesn't change the gameplay all that much. She kind of controls like how Yoshi would control in most Mario games. Otherwise, she does a lot of the same things you would do as SpongeBob, plus gobbling up and spitting out enemies. Nonetheless, I really did like the subtle change, and it does add a little more variety to the gameplay here. Yeah, you know what? I think I'll say it. This one is pretty good. After 2 duds, this was a very nice surprise to come to. And it makes me very happy to find that as well, because any game called Battle for Bikini Bottom deserves to at least be a decent time. The game does have one level in Sandy's Tree Dome, but you know what? The platforming here isn't actually all that tragic, so it really does best SuperSponge in that way. Although I did get stuck at the end because it's not the most linear level, which threw me off a tad. And plus, I only realized what I had to do was jump on this robot up here, which I kept missing because I didn't randomly decide to stop in this area to wait for that robot I didn't know existed to come down. But it's just funny to me. I know that this version of the game has that Squidward boss fight in particular, and while I'm sure the console version would have been quite different, it's still really cool to see it be materialized here. If you do not know the plot of the SpongeBob movie, then you simply are an uncultured swine who has lived their whole life under a rock that's been crushing their bones every waking moment of their life thus far. Without going too deep into it, the plot revolves around SpongeBob journeying across hundreds of miles of Patrick to retrieve King Neptune's crown from Shell City in order to save the falsely accused Mr. Krabs. This movie is one of my favorite pieces of media of all time, and thus I do have a very genuine interest in the video games based off of it. I grew up loving loving the console iteration of this game, but have never really played the GBA counterpart. I will say, a general aspect of these games is how bare bones they feel in terms of the narrative side. The previous games didn't have much story build up either, but I strangely noticed the sparse dialogue a lot more of this one. Thinking about it, it's probably because the story of the movie is so ingrained into my brain that it by default feels like it should be a huge part of the game's structure. But I mean, this is a 2000s GBA game. I understand what we're working with. Keeping the theme of 2D side-scrolls alive, this game actually does something a little different by allowing you to play as both SpongeBob and Patrick at the same time. This is the first entry here from WayForward, known for developing the Shantae games along with a laundry list of licensed titles. Though they're a duo, SpongeBob and Patrick very much control as if they were a single unit, with a basic jump along with a slew of special attacks. The charge up move was one I used like candy because of how fast it propelled them and also how it would knock absolutely everything in their path out of the way. It's like a more robust spin dash in a way. Not the most complex or interesting mechanic, but it does feel satisfying to pull off, I have to say. Otherwise, it's a pretty serviceable 2D platformer. It functions well, has all the sound effects, it really helps illustrate that traveling into the unknown feel the movie embodies. I will say this is one of the more generic feeling SpongeBob games on this list, and here's what I mean by that. Something I praised about quite a few of the games on the list so far is how they were able to really capture the feel of SpongeBob despite the limited technology here. The SpongeBob movie game to me is not nearly as good at doing that. The environments here feel a lot less SpongeBob-like compared to what I've been seeing so far. But then I realized, well, the game is literally just following the plot of the movie, which in general features many locations not that SpongeBob-like. So unlike SuperSponge, this isn't an aspect I'm really blaming the game for. But nonetheless, as a result, this probably won't go down as one of my top faves from this list. It just doesn't embody that SpongeBob feel nearly as well as a lot of the other ones do here. It also feels very neatly put together, which sounds like a compliment, but you know how some people would rather be in a relationship where they're screaming, crying, kissing in the rain, and it's the SpongeBob movie game feels like that significant other you would have no problem bringing to your parents. That's ultimately the best way I can explain it. It is so polished and well put together that I'm almost a little bored by it. This is really me dragging myself more than anything. It really does say a lot when the funniest part about this game is when we get to the part where Mindy gives SpongeBob and Patrick the mustaches, but because the game had to be made alongside the movie, she gives them actual mustaches with fur and everything. It's one of the best parts of revisiting these movie tie-ins, seeing what things match up with the movie and which absolutely do not. Before I go, I guess I should mention the game also includes these paddy wagon sections, but it literally just consists of you moving left, right, and up trying to avoid plants on the road. At least the fellas are having the time of their lives. Now, Lights, Camera, Pants is a really interesting one for me going into it. As you all may or may not know, the original console version is a party game, a completely different species of gaming compared to all the console games that came out beforehand, which were 3D platformers. So as I booted up the GBA version, I was wondering if perhaps this game would take on a similar direction, and well, it's yes and no. Story-wise, this version also centers around Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy filming their own special, except in the GBA version, SpongeBob and friends are tasked with tracking the geriatric duo down, and in exchange, they'll be awarded parts in the movie. I mean, I knew breaking into the movie industry was a tough venture, but damn, some of the things you need to do? Whew. The primary gameplay style on deck here is, of course you already know, a side-scrolling platformer. This game was also made by WayForward and essentially feels like an extended version of the movie game. A huge difference though is that instead of playing as SpongeBob and Patrick, you can not only play as both individually, but also Sandy and Squidward as well. The game allows you to switch between all 4 characters in the levels, and they all have slightly different abilities to help you navigate the levels. I really like using Squidward as he has this propelling ability that shoots him up into the air at an angle, making platforming a lot more interesting with him. Sandy also has a lasso move in air that's great for defeating flying enemies. SpongeBob has a floating ability that allows him to glide down slowly, and Patrick throws ice cream. About the most uncharacteristic thing I've ever seen him do in the game. Why is he wasting perfectly good ice cream? The game doesn't really teach you how to play, by the way, so the game was a lot of trial and error for me. For instance, the movement speed of these characters is honestly very slow, but if you press on the directional pad twice, they will sprint. And I'm like, this would have been great to know for the first chapter, but oddly enough, the minigames got tutorials. And that's a perfect segue into the other aspects of this game. Like its console counterpart, Lights, Camera, Pants also features minigames / alternative gameplay styles for some of the levels. One of them involves you driving a boat on a track, and I have to say, the driving physics here are bonkers, like super out of control bumper cars. It is honestly very difficult to control, but in a way that feels chaotic and fun. So I mean, this is honestly what a really fast-paced boating bash could feel like. I don't know, I genuinely had fun with this one. Another one involves SpongeBob going to the Krusty Krab making Krabby Patties, Patties. All you do here is collect ingredients in the right order to create Krabby Patties, not much to write home about. The weirdest one here for me is the rhythm game, and not because it itself is strange, but because these function as the bosses of the game. Let's start with the positives. I really am digging the music compositions here. But I have to ask, why wasn't the Stadium Rave remix for that? Second of all, while I don't mind the rhythm minigame itself, it's a very odd choice to make this the boss mechanic of the game. This would have better served as a random minigame you'd play at points during the story, but like as a boss, it makes no sense. It doesn't build upon the skills you practice throughout most of the game. I mean, I'm not going to lose sleep over it, but it feels odd to do all that platforming beforehand, only to be met with a rhythm minigame once you reach the main bad guy of the chapter. Maybe this changes later on in the game, but I have no way of knowing. Overall, I think I like this one a little more than the movie game because it takes the polished gameplay of that one and just makes things a little more interesting with additional mechanics and quirky minigames. This is also the only game as far as I know that dares to turn a retirement home into a world of the game, and I just have to laugh and admire the ridiculousness of that scenario. Like, imagine meeting up your colleagues at a game conference, and when you're talking about the games you're working on, you tell them about your retirement home level. WayForward strikes once again, but this time one of the weirdest games in the lineup thus far, Creature from the Krusty Krab. Now, if you know anything about the primary console version, you know that this game has a reputation as being one of the most eccentric and unique video games in the SpongeBob franchise. It literally markets itself as a fever dream and isn't afraid to put SpongeBob and friends in some of the oddest looking places we've ever seen them in. This rendition actually follows the console version quite closely, and as a result is by far the most different game I've played so far when compared to all the other ones. The premise of the game is largely intact. SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton are having very strange and vivid dreams, and the whole game essentially consists of traversing through them. We start off with SpongeBob, of course, who immediately starts off with receiving his driver's license, and then proceeding to join a chaotic tough guys race. Wow, this is visually insane. It was definitely not the smoothest gameplay wise. The driving itself wasn't bad, but pretty unnoteworthy. You just have to drive throughout the course, avoid the attacks of Gary, Patrick, and Plankton, and then you enter another section more akin to an endless runner and have to avoid obstacles. The next part though is very different, where you need to platform along the track to gather car parts, and while the controls aren't bad, why are some of these clouds so fucking small? This is definitely where I ended up losing a good amount of lives and came across one of the game's strongest weak points. I ended up realizing I was playing a chapter, and each chapter is divided into 4 sections. However, if you lose all your lives at any point, you restart at the beginning of the whole chapter, not the section. Life systems need to be retired yesterday. But especially with this game, because it throws so many gameplay styles and changes very quickly that you'll struggle to keep up, and you will lose all your lives at the 4th section and have to start all over. On the bright side, the game is so fast paced that it won't take all that long to get back to where you were, but still highly annoying. Anyway, SpongeBob's chapter ends with him falling to his doom, and you simply have to move him around to avoid jellyfish. I definitely had a dream like this once, and I know you have too. Patrick hosts the next chapter, and let me cook a little bit by saying he's the actual star of the game, and I'm not even trying to be cheeky. His gameplay is a homage to the classic TMNT beat 'em up arcade game, and it couldn't be more perfect fit for Patrick's Starfish Man persona. I mean, I seriously need a full-fledged game of this. The atmosphere is truly divine. The gameplay isn't even all that interesting in the grand scheme of things. All you do is just mash the attack button and platform around the level. But I just think the comic book aura of this chapter makes everything seem so cool that it honestly doesn't affect my enjoyment of the chapter at all. It almost feels like a classic Marvel game I played on the DS when I was a kid in all the best ways possible. I'll have to revisit the console version, but I almost preferred this over that simply because of how this felt very fast-paced and action-packed, while the console version can tend to drag on a bit. Now, Plankton hosts the next chapter where he has to spend most of his dream running away from a rampaging Krabby Patty he concocted in the lab. It's more of a traditional 2D side-scroll variety pack that we come to expect from these games, and honestly is the most boring part of the game thus far. It's literally just basic ass 2D platforming with somewhat awkward controls, and if it wasn't for the fact that I was playing as Plankton, would have only felt like a stripped down version of the previous 2 WayForward games. Even when you play the parts where the giant Krabby Patty is chasing you down, it's still a gigantic snooze fest. That's as far as I got in the game, but I imagine the rest of it mimics the console version just as much, and that we would get even more of a variety of gameplay styles to chew on. I certainly appreciate WayForward embracing the chaos of the game's premise, but this definitely is their weakest effort to me. And even though it's a fearsome beast you're running away from, that Krabby Patty really makes me want McDonald's right now. I just have to say, the moment I'm writing the script for this game, I'm fresh off of dozens of mosquito bites because they simply couldn't let me rock on the 4th of July. But you know what? I am here and am ready to journey to Atlantis, no matter how awkward it may be. Obviously, the console version is one I'm quite familiar with as a mixed experience overall. I had actually heard some very good things about the DS version. I'm looking forward to checking that out when the time comes, but the GBA version, nada, zilch. Like, does it even exist in the stratosphere? Anyway, the GBA version was developed by some company named Altron, taking the baton away from WayForward for the first time. It's got a brand new set of sprites as a result, which I quite liked. They actually really resemble the art style from the first season, especially with SpongeBob's eyes in particular. Really weird choice given we were how many years into the show at this point, but it gave the game some weird nostalgic feel that I really dug. And well, it's another 2D side-scroller, which at this point, I can't really blame them. I mean, what else are you gonna be able to develop in a rush for a mediocre TV special? What's a little interesting about this one is that the partner mechanic from the movie game sort of makes a return as you start off the game controlling both SpongeBob and Patrick. Patrick has an attack that's like that really creepy Pokemon that licks everything, which is quite fitting for him, I'd say. SpongeBob meanwhile has a basic bubble blowing move, which while not the first time we've seen it, it's definitely the more tolerable one since you're able to charge it and more effectively take out baddies. The pair also have a team move, which is just a simple butt slam. I think we all know who's doing most of the work here though. SpongeBob and Patrick bring Squidward what turns out to be the omelet of Atlantis, and he helps them unlock the entrance to the Lost City. Then you play what I assume is the first of many mini-games, which is a rhythm game. I mean, I was totally expecting something like this since the actual special is filled with songs, and quite honestly, this one was quite functional. Again, I think we could have some more exciting music choices on deck here, like the iconic guitar solo in the console game, but I think this was a nice little tangent. I was definitely gagged by SpongeBob and Patrick's facial expressions though. Imagine if they reacted to Squidward's music like this on the show. I mean, not SpongeBob literally looking like he spent a day in Sandy's tree dome when listening to Squidward play. For some reason, Squidward insists on bringing Sandy and Mr. Krabs along to Atlantis, so now SpongeBob and Patrick have to travel throughout Bikini Bound to retrieve them. And it's at this point I really wasn't seeing anything too special on display here. I mean, it's a perfectly functioning 2D platformer and would have totally satisfied the simple-minded middle schooler I was at the time, but nothing about this truly stands out in the pack here. When you recruit Sandy and Mr. Krabs, they actually function as additional playable characters, and depending on what pair of characters you have will determine what sort of team move you have access to. For instance, Patrick and Mr. Krabs have a move where they can mow kelp. At least they make it look somewhat cool. I mean, this is certainly an interesting idea, and it definitely reminds me of Sonic Advance 3 with the variety in team moves depending on your pairing. I don't know, I kind of like this one. It's a decent side scroller, and it also consists of some fun one-off mini games. I mean, it's a fun enough time, and it certainly is nowhere near the worst I've played in this video. This special may have been actual dog shit, but at least the GBA Atlantis Squarepantis isn't the worst version of the game. Way to go, Tiger. I have to say, going back and revisiting all these games that I didn't play as a kid, I was a little nervous. I haven't always loved playing games from this era for the first time in the 2020s simply because gaming standards are so different now compared to what they were before, and it's tough to look at a game from the perspective of what it was doing back then. But I have to say, a lot of these games are still pretty fun. There may be one or two rotten apples that I'm ready to toss into Demetrius' basement, but other than that, I think this is a very enjoyable revisit. It almost makes me sad that I didn't get to play these as a kid, as I think I would have really enjoyed them. That just goes to show you though. Now I learned a lesson I won't soon forget. So listen and you won't regret. Be true to yourself, yeah. Play every single fucking game you can think of at every moment of your life so you don't miss a goddamn thing. And you won't end up like the fool who made this video.